again. I'm Deborah Price, Chair of JCRC, the board, and on behalf of our entire board, I want to welcome you to tonight's JCRC meeting. As most of you know, our JCRC Council is comprised of 35 membership-based Jewish organizations, up to 10 at-large members, and up to 18 board members. Our council currently has 59 members. In addition to the people in the room that have just introduced themselves, we also have many others on Zoom, including two of our speakers. As I mentioned, we're using the webinar format, which means that if you are on Zoom, you're not visible and not able to unmute yourself. However, please use the Q&A function to ask questions of the staff or speakers. There's no voting occurring tonight, so we're not going to hold a council roll vote, and instead we'll begin our meeting. So again, please take your name. If you're just joining us, please take a moment to enter your name and organization into the chat so we know who's with us. And if you're, it's the Q&A feature, not the chat. I'm sorry, it's the Q&A feature, not the chat. So the Q&A right next to that. Thank you, Cheryl. And if you are a guest, let us know what organization you're with. After we hear some words of Torah, we will be hearing a presentation on the separation of church and state, which is a priority area for the JCRC. And as always, though, our first order of business is to set a tone of learning and reflection. We're fortunate tonight to have with us Rabbi Jim Bennett from Congregation Sher Emeth. As you may be aware, Rabbi Bennett, along with Rabbi Andrea Goldstein, Rabbi Susan Talvi, Maharat Rory Picker-Nice, and Rabbi Doug Alper of Kol Ami in Kansas City are plaintiffs in the recently filed lawsuit, Reverend Blackman versus Missouri. This case challenges the state abortion restrictions as a violation of Missouri's constitutional provisions that protect the separation of church and state. Rabbi Bennett, thank you very much for being with us this evening.
Thank you so much, Deborah. And thank you all for your patience with me. You would think after 3 years of COVID and virtual reality, I would have figured out how to get onto Zoom easier, but I hope the Devar Torah is worth the wait. And thank you. So our weekly Torah portion, which is known as Vayakel Pikudei, tells the story of how Moses and the Jewish people completed the building of the Mishkan, the holy sanctuary, and created thereby a dwelling place for God. And among many really interesting facets of this portion is that something the commentators note, which is that in this portion, we read no fewer than 18 times the words Ka'asher tziva Adonai et Moshe, which translates as the eternal, or as God commanded Moses. We have to ask ourselves, when something is repeated so often, what the purpose of this repetition might be. Many commentaries suggest ideas, most of which are related to the later Jewish tradition of the significance of the number 18, in particular, the Shmona Esrei, or the 18 benedictions that are traditionally recited during the Amidah portion of the daily worship service. But the truth is, as is so often the case with unexplained anomalies in the Torah text, there's no clear and certain reason why this phrase, as God commanded Moses, is repeated so many times in one very short passage of the Torah. And one thing we think about is it really possible that any of the ancient Israelites would not have already thought that the tabernacle, the Mishkan, was to be built according to God's instructions and commands? And did they actually need to be reminded 18 times over and over again that they had to do exactly what God was telling them? Which leads us to conclude that there must be a deeper meaning. And that's what I'd like to share with you this evening as a Devar Torah, one possible deeper meaning. You see, for the ancient Israelites, as for us, creating a dwelling place for God is one of the most important things in our lives, in our spiritual lives. Making the mundane, the ordinary, holy, turning mere ordinary life and duties and responsibilities into something and someplace where we believe God can dwell may in fact be one of the purposes of a life of faith. For our ancestors, at least, this was certainly their purpose. For generations, finding a way to balance this tension between our physical world, our day-to-day lives, and the holy, the divine, to define the difference between what's ordinary and holy between us and God has always been one of the greatest of our challenges. We live in a very physical, real, tangible world, a world that often does not seem to care what God has to say. The material world doesn't really lend itself to thinking of our actions and our lives and our values as holy, and instead often, as we well know, cultivates self-interest, corruption, human shortcomings, and injustice. So the Torah in this portion maybe, just maybe, is trying to balance this, to remind the people of Israel that every single detail of the building of the Mishkan had to be built according to God's plan. God had already given us instructions on how to build the Mishkan, but when it came to actually implementing these instructions in real time, we needed a reality check to assure that the material world, the one in which we live every day, was aligned with the holy, with the divine. It's one thing to build a Mishkan in heaven, but down here on earth, in our domain, the domain of human beings, we have to figure out how to make our world and our lives and our decisions holy. The problem is, this isn't so obvious. Human beings are frequently tempted to suggest that our own understanding of what God wants of us is simple. However, in all of humanity's attempts to understand or deny God, sometimes things are glaringly missing. Things like what the prophet Micah taught us, to do justice, to love mercy, and to walk humbly with God. I think the challenge of justice, to try always to do the right thing, needs to be always before us to attain holiness. And the obligation of kindness and mercy, to strive always to act with empathy and compassion, need to be always before us. And the courage of humility to acknowledge the possibility, just the possibility, that perhaps we might have it wrong, is essential for holiness. It's never enough to claim that we are doing what God wants us to do. Lots of people all the time claim that they are doing what God wants. These days, especially all around us, we see evidence of people claiming God's authority for decisions that we believe are not consistent with how we understand God's call to holiness. When those in power, like our elected officials or others, claim that they know God's will, I believe we need to test this claim against Micah's litmus test. Is it just? Is it kind? And is it humble? Perhaps that's why this week the Torah calls us over and over again to remember to do what God truly commanded and not to fall into the trap of claiming to be doing God's work when perhaps nothing is further from the truth. As God commanded, do justice, be kind, and live with humility in God's presence. May this be God's will, and may this be our will. Amen.
Thank you very much, Rabbi Bennett. As you may all recall, last summer, the council took a survey to help identify priority issues for JCRC, and the most consistent priority area was the separation of church and state. We are fortunate to have with us this evening one of our country's experts on this topic, Rob Boston. Rob is a senior advisor for Americans United for the Separation of Church and State and editor of Church and State, which is Americans United monthly member magazine. Rob has worked at Americans United since 1987 and is the author of 4 books. His most recent book is entitled Taking Liberties: Why Religious Freedom Doesn't Give You the Right to Tell Other People What to Do. Following Rob, we will hear from Cynthia Holmes, president of American United St. Louis chapter, who will share some information about the chapter's current and previous work. Cynthia is an attorney and an active leader with the Cooperative Baptist Fellowship, Baptist Joint Committee for Religious Liberty, as well as president of the St. Louis chapter of Americans United for Separation of Church and State. She serves on the governing boards of Good Faith Media, Missouri Jobs with Justice, Workers' Rights Steering Committee, and the Great Rivers Environmental Law Center. Welcome, Rob. We look forward to hearing from you.
Thank you, Deborah, and thanks to all of you for listening tonight. All nations have an origin story, and that origin story is informed by many things, some facts, some myths, and sometimes aspirations. And the United States is no different. If you think of our origin story, the claim is often made that we were founded for religious freedom. Well, there's some truth in that, but there's a good bit of mythology in it too. People came to this new world for many reasons. Some came for reasons of economics, money, for new opportunities. Some were brought here against their will in chains. Some did come for religious freedom, the Pilgrims, the Puritans, but they came for religious freedom only for themselves. And they did not have a sense of religious freedom as we understand that concept today, a broadly applied principle that includes everyone, no matter what their religious faith may be or whether they have a faith at all. So our origin story is a little bit more complicated than perhaps what is presented as nuggets on television talk shows or in some of the books that we may read. It is a complex story, but at the end of the day, it is a powerful story, and it is a story worth embracing and upholding, and it is a story that we need to carry forth and continue to improve. Now, if we think about this story, we think about a country that, as it strived for its independence and tried to go its own way, had many different models for how church and state, religion and government would interact. And the Massachusetts Bay Colony, of course, we know that was very much a theocratic state where laws reflected the Puritans' understanding and interpretation of a very strict form of Christianity, where laws would restrict how people could behave, how they could worship, what they could do. And if you disagreed with them, well, they would throw you out or sometimes even execute you. And there were people who fought against that almost from the very beginning. Roger Williams was a dissenting clergyman who argued strongly for everyone to have the freedom of conscience. And Roger Williams, finding himself in conflict with the Puritan leadership, left that area, went into the wilderness, and bought some land from the native population. Williams had a good relationship with the natives. He spoke several of their languages. He bought his land. He didn't just take it like a lot of other people did. And he founded a new city called Providence, the capital of what eventually became Rhode Island. Providence was a bold experiment because, as Roger Williams believed, everyone should have the right to decide for themselves what they would believe and how they would interact with God, or whether they would choose to interact at all. So here you have the sort of the kernel of real religious freedom in America, this tradition handed down to us by Roger Williams of a colony where people didn't necessarily agree on matters of faith, but that was okay because the government didn't have an opinion. And the government wasn't telling you, here's how you should worship, here's how you should behave when you're in a house of worship. The government was having basically an attitude of hands off and allowing people to make their own decisions. Now that model ended up in some other colonies, but other colonies went in other directions. Some of our colonies, later our states, had established churches, official religions, laws based on some understanding that a group had of the Christian faith, and it was always Christian. And sometimes those unions of religion and government, church and state, ended up with a lot of persecution and violence. So after the revolution, there were some thinkers who began to come forth and talk about maybe a different way of doing things. You know, nobody had really tried to separate religion and government before. The understanding had been for hundreds of years, thousands of years maybe, that the government, in the Western world at least, needed the prop of the church, and that the church needed help from the state, and that these two entities needed to be very closely aligned. Well, what was the result of that in Europe? Hundreds of years of violence, war, persecution, and death. And our founders knew about this. And they also knew about the experiences on our own shores, where people had been persecuted for the sake of conscience. So eventually some thinkers began to say there has to be a better way, looking at Roger Williams as a model and asking, how could we order religion and government differently? A key experience occurred in Virginia, where Thomas Jefferson, during the Revolution, crafted a law establishing religious freedom, a bill for religious freedom. Now, during the Revolution, people had other things on their minds. So this particular piece of legislation didn't get a hearing right off the bat. But after the Revolution, it surfaced again. Jefferson's bill for establishing religious freedom in Virginia did two things. It disestablished the Anglican Church as Virginia's state church, and it guaranteed to everyone the right to worship as they determined. Now, keep those two concepts in mind. No official church and complete religious freedom for everybody, because we're going to see those again later. But for now, this is the Virginia statute. This is the Virginia law. Thomas Jefferson was not in the Virginia legislature at the time this was debated. He was serving as our ambassador to France, so he was living in Paris. But his close ally and protege, James Madison, took that bill and helped push it through the Virginia legislature. There were people who argued that, oh yes, religious toleration is okay. We can have religious toleration in Virginia, but we're going to limit it to Christians. So if their version had carried the day, you would have had the right in Virginia to belong to whatever religion you wanted, as long as it was a variety of Christianity. But that wasn't good enough. And Jefferson and Madison knew that. And Madison argued very forcefully for the right of everyone to believe as guided by conscience. And when he pushed that law through the Virginia legislature intact, not limiting its protections to Christians, but to everybody, Jefferson rejoiced, saying that his law for religious freedom was meant to encompass the Jew and the Gentile, the Hindu and the Mohammedan, the infidel of every denomination. Now think about that. That is a startling fact, that we were going to extend religious freedom way beyond the Christian experience. And this is important because the sort of core belief of what we call Christian nationalism, sort of a more modern term for the religious right, is that the United States was founded to be a Christian nation. But there is so much evidence to the contrary. And this is just one important piece. That law in Virginia, the Virginia statute, later informed our First Amendment. James Madison, who pushed that bill through, who wrote in a document called the Memorial and Remonstrance Against Religious Assessments to help further the cause of religious liberty in Virginia and opposed taxes for churches, was very much inspired. And when he was drafting the Constitution, Madison is called the father of the Constitution, and later the Bill of Rights, the First Amendment, he took those concepts with him. No establishment of religion, no official religion, and religious freedom for everybody. I mentioned a moment ago, keep those concepts in mind because we're going to see them again. And here's where we see them in our very First Amendment. 16 words. Congress shall make no law respecting an establishment of religion or prohibiting the free exercise thereof. And of course, the amendment goes on to protect other core freedoms. But for our purposes tonight, that protection of religious freedom is the most important. Those concepts, no official religion, religious freedom for everybody, informed by the experience of Virginia, carried to the national level. Now, the Bill of Rights originally applied only to the federal government. It didn't apply to the states. So the states that had established churches or church taxes or other forms of support for religion did not have to give those up. That came later after the Civil War. But for now, we're talking about an amendment that applies only to the federal government. But that is still very significant because it's a clear indication that there was never intended to be any sort of official church or recognition of Christianity in America. Now, over the years, I've had the occasion to debate a lot of people who feel differently about this issue, who argue that the United States was founded to be a Christian nation. But the debate really begins and ends with the words of our Constitution. If a Christian nation had been the intent of the founders, our Constitution would say that, and it does not. In fact, our Constitution is a secular document. It does not contain the words Christianity, Christ, Jesus, or even God anywhere in it. And in fact, at the end of Article 6, there is an interesting provision which states that there shall be no religious test for public office. And when the framers said religious test, they didn't mean like a pop quiz. That what they meant was there will be no religious qualification for public office at the federal level. You cannot be required to believe a certain thing about religion as a condition of holding federal office. Why did they put that in there? Because many of the states did, in fact, have laws like that on the books that limited office to Christians or Trinitarian Protestants and so on. None of that at the federal level. Again, that is a radical departure from past practices and certainly and very much in conflict with the Christian nation idea. In fact, our founders never intended to establish an officially Christian nation, and everybody knew it at the time. Some people were very angry about that. There were sermons that pastors read from the pulpit where they attacked the Constitution, they attacked the Bill of Rights, they attacked the First Amendment for being anti-religious because it didn't contain any preference to Christianity. But the founders' vision came through, and that was handed down to us. That is the history that we should be upholding. That is the history that we have the right to be so proud of. Now, sometimes people ask, well, what about the separation of church and state? What about that metaphor of the wall of separation between church and state, which the Supreme Court in previous years has embraced? They're not now, but in previous years they have. What about that metaphor? Where did that come from? The people who are on the other side of this argument will sometimes say, well, the words separation of church and state aren't in the Constitution, and they're right. The literal words are not. The concept clearly is, though. And that phrase, a wall of separation between church and state, comes from the pen of Thomas Jefferson. Jefferson was elected president in 1800, and he received a letter from a group of Baptists in the city of Danbury, Connecticut. Connecticut at this time had what you might call a quasi-established church, congregational church, the remnants of the old Puritan church. And the Congregationalists were making life very difficult for members of other religious groups. They would impose church taxes on people. They would make it hard for them to worship. And these Baptists were chafing under these restrictive rules. They wanted real religious freedom. They wanted what Thomas Jefferson and James Madison had brought to Virginia. And they wrote to Jefferson to express their frustration with the situation in Connecticut and to say that they wished to see the day when the vision of Thomas Jefferson was spread throughout the nation. Jefferson wrote back to thank them and to agree with what they were saying. And in that letter, he invoked the metaphor of the First Amendment erecting a wall of separation between church and state. Now, sometimes Christian nationalists will argue that this isn't a very important letter. Jefferson was just, responding as a thank you and as a courtesy. But as a matter of fact, the history of the letter shows quite differently. It was an important letter. Remember, this is a long time ago, more than 200 years ago. The only way you could really get your views out were through the printed word. There's no telephone, there's no internet, there's no email, there's no social media, no radio, but they did have newspapers. And oftentimes, letters written by public officials like presidents and governors and others would become public documents. They were reprinted in newspapers of the day and everybody could see them. And politicians knew this. So when they wrote their letters, sometimes they were very careful. And if they wanted a document to say something publicly, they were aware of that. Before he responded to the letter from the Danbury Baptists, Jefferson consulted with his Attorney General, Levi Lincoln, and the Postmaster General, and asked for their opinion about his response. And he said in a cover memo to these individuals that he felt that this Baptist letter gave him an opportunity to make a major statement on religious liberty and his views thereof. So he was using his response very deliberately to make a statement that he knew would be carried nationwide, and indeed it was. So this was not just some hasty little note that Jefferson dashed off or a courtesy. He put a lot of thought into it. He originally had wanted to use the letter to explain why he didn't issue days calling for prayer and fasting. Jefferson was our only president who never did that. And he'd been attacked for it. People accused him of being hostile to faith. He was called an atheist. All sorts of stories were told about him. Levi Lincoln felt that maybe Jefferson didn't need to get into that business of discussing days of prayer and fasting in the response, that would antagonize clergy in New England. It's best leave that alone. So Jefferson didn't address that, but he made a note in the margin that he wanted to do that originally. So he sent a letter, as we expected, as everyone expected at the time. It did appear in print in newspapers throughout the country, and it has rung down through the ages and had been embraced by the Supreme Court until recent times, and has inspired many people, even abroad, who have yearned for the type of religious freedom that we have in the United States. So what about this idea of the Christian nation? We hear it so much, it informs the politics of many people in this country today. Or many people believe a lot of things that may be incorrect, but it still motivates them to behave in a certain way. Where did that come from? And that's an interesting question, because we really need to look a little bit at that history. To understand where we are today, we need to know where we have been. And the Christian nation myth has been a powerful motivating factor for people for a long time, but it really is a post-Civil War artifact. Think about the Civil War for a minute and what the trauma that caused. An entire region of the nation in destruction. People who had formerly been enslaved suddenly freed with no real plan to integrate them into American society. In fact, much hostility toward the very idea of integrating them. Death, bloodshed. People were reeling from that. And whenever you have a situation like that, where there's so much chaos and confusion, violence and death, some people naturally are going to gravitate toward a solution that is based in religion. In other words, the belief that if only we hadn't somehow offended God, this would not have happened to us. And people seriously argued that during the Civil War. That the war, in fact, was a type of punishment on the nation for our sins. And one of those sins was slighting God by not mentioning him in the Constitution. In fact, the phrase "in God we trust" first began to appear on coins in the North during the Civil War, because a minister in Pennsylvania got the idea in his head that we had offended God by not mentioning him in the Constitution, by not establishing Christianity as a national religion. And that one way to get back in God's good graces would be to mention him on our coinage. And maybe he would take away this awful Civil War. So that phrase started being stamped on coins, although it was not codified for use on all currency until the 1950s. But that's when it first started to appear. So you started to see these types of experiences where people were looking for some kind of national embrace of a theology as a way of dealing with a trauma. And after the Civil War, a movement arose of Protestant ministers, mainly in the North, who argued that it was time to correct what they considered to be the founders' mistake. So they argued for rewriting the preamble to the Constitution to include explicit references to God, Jesus Christ, and Christianity. This was the so-called Christian Nation Amendment, and it was spearheaded by an organization that went by the name of the National Reform Association. The National Reform Association was a coalition of conservative, mostly Protestant ministers, and they had a full agenda. Aside from pushing the Christian Nation Amendment, they wanted to restrict commerce and sales and business on Sunday. They wanted to restrict certain types of material that people could read and be exposed to if they felt that material was blasphemous or somehow insulted religion. They sought to infuse their version of Christianity into the growing public school system, which was something that really began to grow in the 1840s, and after the Civil War began to take off in many parts of the country. So they argued for that as well. And they had success with some of their initiatives. They did manage to infuse Christianity in some public schools. They did manage to pass Sunday closing laws, also known as blue laws in some states. They did restrict material that people could read if they considered it blasphemous. But they never could get their Christian Nation Amendment through. In fact, the US House of Representatives only considered it on one occasion in the latter half of the 19th century, and they voted it down. And one of the things they said in voting it down, this was just a committee vote, not the full House, but the committee said they were well aware of the dangers of merging church and state in the old world, by which they meant Europe, and all the problems that had created. Now, having lost that battle, the National Reform Association didn't just slink off and go away. They continued to press for their other agenda items. And over the years, a kind of curious thing happened. Although the National Reform Association was not able to append its Christian Nation Amendment to the Constitution and was not able to rewrite the preamble to the Constitution, the myth that they promoted of a Christian nation and the idea of a Christian nation took hold in many religious communities in America. And people started to believe that instead of the actual history. Now, I liken this to a type of historical creationism. Think about how the creationists don't like evolution. They're offended by it. They don't accept it. They don't believe in it, even though it's well established and is accepted by the scientific community. So they came up with this other thing instead that they call creationism, and they try to get that promoted and get that into the schools as well, even though it has no backing. Millions of people rally to that standard. Same with the Christian nation myth. It doesn't have any historical validity to it. It is debunked by anyone who chooses to read and can read our Constitution, yet it has great power. And I think it has great power for a couple of reasons. And it's important to understand those too as we kind of try to move forward. One of those reasons is that it's used by politicians as a motivating factor for some folks. You know, the idea that we can get back to this Christian nation can motivate people to vote in a certain way. And for some people, the Christian nation myth is it's a kind of comforting story that leads them to believe that the nation has been fundamentally good, even though we know that we've had a very troubled history. Our history of systemic racism, our history of violence during the Jim Crow era with lynchings and murder, our history of suppression of women, our history of suppression of LGBTQ rights, our frequent bouts of xenophobia and fear of immigrants and the other. Any honest look at our history shows that there have been a lot of problems. But there are people today trying to sanitize all that. I mean, amazingly, I'm sure you've all read stories about some states in Florida and in other parts of the country where there's an attempt to sanitize history curriculum and remove negative references and material that makes some people uncomfortable. Well, I've often believed that if you're studying history and the only thing it's doing is making you feel good about your country, you're not really studying history. You're studying something else, because the actual historical record is usually a record of, frankly, unpleasant things, violence, war, and oppression. But it's also a story of how we, if we put our minds to it, can overcome those things and rise above them. But there are people who just don't want to do that. They would rather believe a myth instead. And the Christian nation, it fills that role for them. You know, we had this great, wonderful thing, this Christian nation. And if we could just get back to it, we'd be so much better off. You know, that's the sort of propagandistic view of the Christian nation. And you can think about politicians who parrot that line and have parroted it and use it now as a way of getting people to behave a certain way or to vote a certain way. You know, even slogans like "Make America Great Again" imply that there was a period where it was great and we just need to get back to that, some golden age. And we all know that's a myth. We all know that in the past, the age was only golden for the wealthy, white, mostly male elite who held power. And that people are trying, and they want to get back to that. They want to go back to a period where they were at the top of the pyramid and everyone else was at the bottom scrambling. So the Christian nation myth promotes that idea for a lot of people, motivates them, and gives them an opportunity to basically embrace a conspiracy theory. You know, I've heard people say things over the years about how this history is being suppressed. People don't want you to know the real facts about how the nation was founded. But of course, that information is available for anybody who chooses to read it. Any number of historical books will recount the actual history of the United States and the fact that we are a secular nation with a secular constitution and religious freedom for everybody. But there are people who are very threatened by that and very frightened by that. And I also think the Christian nation myth provides for those individuals a type of refuge from a changing America. Think about what this country used to be as opposed to what it is today. In the 1950s, something like 96% of Americans said that they were Christian. 96%. That is an astounding figure. If you look at that figure today, it's hovering somewhere between 60 to 65%. And I'm sure you've all read stories about the recent trends of religiosity in America. Growing numbers of people declaring themselves spiritual but not religious, or when asked to name their religious preference, say none, the so-called nuns. They're not necessarily atheists or humanists or agnostics, but they don't affiliate with any particular religious community. They have their own spirituality. They're doing it themselves. And in doing so, they are actually operating within a historic framework that's been with us for a long time. People have been engaging in this type of religious inquiry and changing their minds and creating their own spiritual blends for a very long time. Thomas Jefferson was once asked to explain his religious view, to which he said, "I am a sect unto myself as far as I know." So the idea that you could kind of create your own spiritual brew has been a powerful force throughout the course of our history. For some reason, it has really taken off within the past few years. And more Americans are taking advantage of a religious freedom that was guaranteed to them by our framers in our Constitution. Now, most of us look at that and say, hooray, that's the purpose of religious freedom. You have the right to make your own decisions in these areas. But some people are very threatened by that. They are threatened by a changing America. They were intimidated by the civil rights movement. They were intimidated by the women's rights movement. They were intimidated by the LGBTQ rights movement. They were intimidated now by transgender rights, by the rights of non-believers, by more and more people standing up and saying, yes, I too am part of the American experiment, and I demand the same rights and privileges that have been extended to the majority. Again, most of us look at that, hear that, and say, yes, absolutely. But there are some folks in this country who are very threatened by that, threatened by the changing composition of a nation that is less white, more diverse, more open. Frightened by that, alarmed by that, trying to shut that down to the extent that they can. So the Christian nation myth becomes something that leads them to believe that there is a golden age and we're going to get back to that. The problem with their golden age is that it was oppressive to many people. I mentioned earlier about how the National Reform Association and other pressure groups in the 19th century infused some public schools with Protestant forms of Christianity. They did that in some states. And the first people to object to that were not Jews, were not atheists, they were Roman Catholics, because the prayers being said were Protestant in nature, and the Bible being read was the King James Version. And these Catholics stood up and said, this is not our Christianity, this is not our expression, this is not our experience. We do not want our children being exposed to this in a public institution. They fought it in state courts in the 19th century. And in some states they won, in some states they didn't, but they fought it in state courts. By the early 1960s, the issue had reached the US Supreme Court, and the US Supreme Court put a stop to those state-mandated religious exercises and landmark decisions in 1962 and 1963. The Supreme Court did not say, and never has said, that students don't have the right to pray in school. They've simply said schools cannot sponsor those prayers or that Bible reading or impose it on a student against his or her will. If a student wants to pray before the school day begins, or before they eat their lunch or take a test, or wherever they might feel the need for spiritual guidance, they can do that in an individual and non-disruptive manner. Students can meet with their friends and form religious clubs at the secondary school level. They can learn about the role of religion and its impact in history and art and literature. In fact, they should learn those things from an objective standpoint. That's perfectly legal. So there's a lot of room for religion in schools, just as long as it isn't coerced or forced. So a lot of what these groups tried to do wasn't really about religious freedom at all. It was about religious supremacy and religious oppression. And our courts were right to put a stop to that. Now, before I conclude, I want to say just a few things about where we are today, because the situation is very dire. And when I heard earlier that the members of your group identified separation of church and state as the most pressing issue, I was pleased to hear that, because it is. Separation of church and state, I really do believe, runs through so many of the struggles we're having today. Reproductive freedom and abortion. Of course, in Missouri, we have an important case that our organization has filed on behalf of several members of the clergy, seeking to strike down restrictive laws in Missouri on the basis that that violates the separation of church and state by elevating a certain religious view over all others. That issue is strongly impacted by separation of church and state. The right of the members of the LGBTQ community and marriage equality, very much affected by separation of church and state, because the arguments made against marriage equality before the Supreme Court ruled were explicitly religious in nature. People would say, well, we shouldn't allow members of the same sex to marry because the Bible says that's wrong, or the Pope issued a decree against it, this sort of thing. Well, those are religious statements. They should have no impact on secular law. Issues we're struggling with about the proper role of religion in public education, still seeing those today. Again, obviously a very powerful church-state issue, one that's been with us a long time. Questions about what type of symbols we're going to have in public spaces. We have situations where large crosses are suddenly being described as war memorials. Well, they're not war memorials for everybody. They're war memorials for Christians. The cross is the central unifying symbol of the Christian faith. It does not represent members outside that religion. Yet the Supreme Court has allowed those to stand in some cases, even flirting with the idea that the cross can have a secular meaning. Very offensive, should be offensive to Christians, mostly. Debates about what religious freedom really is, what it means. We've been seeing a lot of that lately. Religious freedom is a great and noble concept, one we should be proud of. We pioneered it. Yet it is being used today as a cloak to cover shabby forms of discrimination. People arguing that they should have the right in a secular business, not a house of worship, a secular business, to deny service to Muslims, Jews, atheists, members of the LGBTQ community. Now, everybody knows that a house of worship has that right. They don't have to let you in if they don't want to. But we're talking here about secular businesses, bakeries, caterers, photographers, the owners of B&Bs, other types of industries, where they're saying that they don't want to serve members of certain backgrounds because of religious belief. This takes us back to the days of Jim Crow, when African Americans were told they couldn't stay in certain places, they couldn't eat in certain restaurants, they couldn't be in certain places. We thought we had removed that with the civil rights laws. Now we're seeing it dangerously reestablished by the Supreme Court using the guise of religious freedom, and it is appalling. We continue to fight that, and we will continue to fight that at Americans United. These are very difficult times. These are very challenging times. And people have been asking me, well, what are we going to do? And I will tell you, the first thing we're going to do is recognize the long-term nature of this struggle. It took a long time for the Supreme Court to erode separation of church and state to the point that they have, and we are not going to get it back overnight. It's going to take years and decades. Some of us in this room, some of you listening to me speak these words, may not live long enough to see this return. I may not. I hope to, but I may not. It's going to take a long time. But we are going to hand that baton, pass that off to a new generation of leaders to rise up to continue the work. Think about the groups that managed to urge the Supreme Court to overturn Roe v. Wade. For 49 years, they opposed it. 49 years. Now, I deplore what they did, but part of me has to admire the tenacity that they worked on that for nearly half of a century to bring about that result. We need to be just as determined. I do think that we have some cause for hope in that younger generations are less interested in fighting these culture wars and say that they are less interested and are more accepting. And hopefully this will come to an end soon. So if you ask me what we're going to do, I will tell you what we're going to do. That wall of separation that Thomas Jefferson spoke of, we're going to rebuild that wall day by day, week by week, month by month, year by year, brick by brick. Let me say that again. Day by day, week by week, month by month, year by year, brick by brick, until it is once again the high and firm protector of religious freedom that it was always intended to be. And I invite you to join us at Americans United in this important and noble endeavor. Thank you.
Thank you, Rob, very much. We do have time for a couple of questions. So if anyone in the room would like to raise your hand with a question, or anyone on Zoom would like to put a question into the Q&A. Okay. I'm going to give right.
How is it that the founders had this broad-minded view on religion, but maintained such an exclusive view on gender and race?
Yes, that's a very good question. And it's a frustrating one and an exasperating one. In some ways, the founders were so farsighted in areas like religion and religious freedom, and in other ways, completely products of their time, who could not see beyond their own prejudices. That's why we have to be careful not to deify the founders. We can celebrate their achievements when they were right, but we absolutely must acknowledge when they were wrong. And remember that even when they were wrong, they gave us a framework that we can change. We can alter our Constitution. We can make it more inclusive, and we've done so in the past. We should not be afraid to look at some of their handiwork and assume that it's, like a fence post rooted in cement. It can never get out of that situation, because it can. And we can make changes, and we should make changes to make this country the more exclusive experience that we all know it must become. Inclusive experience we all know it must become.
Additional questions? Anyone else on the screen? All right. Rob, thank you again very much for your time. We very much appreciate it.
My pleasure.
We're going to turn now to Cynthia Holmes.
Hi, good evening. Thank you for having me. Like Rob, I was thrilled to hear that your survey showed that your folks think separation of church and state is important. We have a long history with the JCRC going back till at least the early 90s. One of our former presidents, Reverend Rudy Polito, I think was the first recipient of your JCRC Norman Stack Award. And Americans United, which was founded 75 years ago, was founded largely by people of faith, Jews, Christian Scientists, Baptists, Seventh-day Adventists, folks who had their religion trampled on by the majority. So I'm happy for that. I was concerned today because I looked at your policy positions online and saw that separation of religion and government mentions two things at the very bottom, both of which were passed in 1997 and 1995, respectively. I have a history of going to Jeff City with Marilyn Ratkin and others from your organization to advocate for religious liberty and against bills that limit it, and we're still doing that today. Rob didn't get to talk much about the lawsuit. I'll give you a little bit of information, and this might be something that you want to take up on a whole evening program. It's astounding that this would be filed in Missouri, as backward as we are on these issues, but we actually have among the strongest positions in our state constitution for separation of church and state. 3 provisions: one, that you shouldn't spend any money from the public to support religion, that you shouldn't coerce anybody to participate in religion, and that you shouldn't favor any religion. And the lawsuit sets out in great detail how each of those is violated. The plaintiffs are 13 clergy. You were told the Jewish folks, but they're Christians, UCC, Methodist, the Episcopal bishop of this area, all are plaintiffs. And the other reason it was brought in Missouri is usually abortion restrictions have been, we're just trying to protect women and children. These things are dangerous, abortions are dangerous, so on and so forth. In Missouri, the legislators that passed these things have said what AU's director, Rachel Laser, likes to say, the quiet part out loud. One of them said, as a Catholic, I have to do this. One of them says, I'll be accountable to my creator. One of them quotes from the Psalms. So this is a unique position, because if we win that these statutes establish a religion in Missouri, it knocks out the whole statute, as opposed to like the baker, the cake baker, who if he wins, he just gets an exemption from Colorado law. What the St. Louis chapter has been around almost as long as national. We were only behind them by a couple of years. I won't tell you how long ago it was, but I was reading Church and State magazine that came to my dad when I was in grade school. And that's been a long time. But we have been going and are concerned about bills in the legislature. And we really need to get together with JCRC and get some advocacy on these. For years, we've had a Bible bill that would allow teaching of the New Testament and the quote unquote Hebrew scriptures. They originally said the Old and New Testament until a Baptist minister board member of ours pointed out to them that the Old Testament is different than the Hebrew scriptures. I can't explain that, but you could ask your rabbi. But this time, the sponsor of a bill to allow a so-called elective course on the Bible was my rep, Carla May, who is a Democrat, and she introduced this in the legislature. Her testimony was basically that Jesus Christ has made such an important difference in her life that it is important that we have this available to public school students. So again, the motivation is now absolutely clear. And of course, just like the coach who prayed in Washington after the football game, if you were in a small town in Missouri and you have an elective course on the Bible and it's being taught on a volunteer basis by your football coach and you would like to get off the bench, there's a lot of coercion there. Another big concern that we need to be addressing with y'all is the empowerment scholarships. These are vouchers in essence. They are going to allow people to get total tax credits to give money to quote unquote educational organizations that can then give them to kids. It's the treasurer is who administers it. And as of last year, the organizations that have applied to be administrators of this bill are all religious. There's a Jewish one called Aga Israel in Illinois. I don't know them, but I suspect they're very fundamentalist. The Children's Tuition Fund, which supports Christian schools on an international basis. The Stanley Herzog Foundation, whose purpose is to accelerate the development of quality Christ-centered K through 12 education. The Missouri District of the Lutheran Church, Missouri Synod, a foundation based at the Cardinal Regali Center here and the Archdiocese of Kansas City. So the notion that these are going to not be going to religious schools, well, it's allowed by the law now as being proposed, and it's not going to go to and kids be favored who are looking for a religious education on the taxpayer dime, I think is naive. We'll just leave it at that. I'll just do one more bill that we're following in the legislature. It is a student association bill. It prohibits public institutions of higher learning from taking any action or enforcing any policy that denies a belief-based student association benefits available to other student associations. So the young fascists of Missouri say, whose belief is that Jews will not replace us and that white people need to rule, would have the same rights at the University of Missouri, including student funds that go to sanctioned organizations. Again, this is a very fundamentalist, crazy religious bill. Probably may not get passed this year, but we have been fighting that Bible bill for years and it looks like it's going this year. So I'm hoping, I don't know if you still have a church state committee. We used to work with them a lot. I know I spent a lot of time going to Jeff City with Marilyn Ratkin and others. And our local chapter would love to do that again. So again, thanks for having me. I would have loved to have been there in person, but I've got some kind of cold and I wouldn't want to be in a room with me today. So appreciate all of you and all that you do.
Thank you, Cynthia. Thank you for joining us. And we do, again, have a couple of minutes if anyone has questions. So I'll ask Cheryl. I don't see anything in the Q&A.
I'm going to come here just so Cynthia can see me. So thank you, Cynthia. You have pointed to an issue that is of concern to all of us, which is that we haven't updated our policies in a long time, specifically around church state, which is the process that we want to go through now. Many of our policies bring us to Jefferson City on these issues, but they're not couched specifically in church state terms. So like last year, we did testify against that student group discrimination bill. And we're down in Jeff City regularly on transgender issues, on what you can teach in classrooms, on Medicaid expansion, on reproductive justice, all which we do couch in the terms of church-state separation, but we really want to develop something that explicitly starts at that level and then trickles down into all the value statements that we have around various social justice issues. Because as you and Rob have so eloquently suggested, we can make very strong arguments on all of our social justice issues as church-state separation issues. And so that's a place we want to get to. So I look forward to working with you. No specific question, but I wanted to give you an update on what we were up to.
Right.
Thanks, Cheryl. Cheryl, is anything in the chat? A Q&A? Okay. Anyone in the room have a question? Or anyone again on screen? All right. Well, Cynthia, thank you again. And thank you again to Rob. We really appreciate you being a part of our program this evening. As Cheryl just alluded to, JCRC is working on creating a policy on the separation of church and state, and also rethinking several of our existing policies through this lens. So we know you're going to be a valuable resource during that process. So thank you again. All right. So you may have seen, I think it was on the agenda that went out. We were going to have a presentation from Paul AJC on anti-Semitism. That is actually going to be taking place on May 9th. So stay tuned for that. Very exciting. Looking forward to that. Thank you again, Paul and AJC. So with that, before I open the floor for community announcements, I want to thank several council members for their involvement in the Showing Up program, a joint effort between the JCRC and Jewish Federation to learn skills for more productive dialogue around anti-Semitism and Israel. Joey Abels with Maryville Hillel, Jessica Eaglenik of Cole Arena, Beth Newman of Temple Israel, and Dana Silverblatt, Council at Large member, are all part of the cohort. In addition, former council members Benjamin Singer, the Executive Director of Central Reform Congregation, Sonia Vaughn, the daughter of the council members of Council Member Susan Warshaw, Eleanor Warshaw, and former JCRC staff member Connie Flex are part of the 18-member cohort. The program will have its last formal session tomorrow evening, and the programming and engagement have been outstanding. Is there anyone in the room or on Zoom who would like to share any information or make any announcements? I'll start looking around in the room. No. And Cynthia.
Oh, I was just going to say, the Missouri Women's Political Caucus tomorrow evening is having a program. You can go to their website on the lawsuit. And Denise Lieberman will be speaking, who's the local attorney. So people can get a much deeper dive into that. And then a few people will be talking about it from their faith perspective that are not parties to the suit.
Thank you.
Missouri Women's Political Caucus. And I believe 7.
Great. Any other announcements or information? All right. Well, I hope that you will all mark your calendars for JCRC's Community Seder, which is on April 20th. Our annual ZEDEC Awards on May 11th. And you should have received information about registration for both of these events. Again, I want to thank all of our speakers this evening, Rabbi Jim Bennett, Rob Boston, and Cynthia Holmes of Americans United. Our last council meeting before we break for the summer will be on Monday, May 9th at 7, and it'll be both in person and via Zoom. And Rory has 2 minutes.
Yeah, so we should just make this announcement. So we should all mark your calendar for the Tzedek Awards, but especially because we have a phenomenal group of honorees for this year. And I'm going to do this off the cuff. So let's make sure that I get all the honors. But we have our own Nancy Solomon Deloge, who is going to get the Newmark Emerging Leader Award, which is why she had her very own film crew here tonight. You might have noticed her entourage. We have Rabbi Jeffrey Stiffman and Dr. Arlene Stiffman getting the Batya Abramson Goldstein Legacy Award, and Marie Kenyon from the Archdiocese getting the Norman Stack Community Relations Award. And we have the brand new Joel and Joanne Iskowich Israel Award, which is going to Don Rubin. In addition to that, we have a new series of Newmark Institute Pluralism Awards, which are going to partners in the community, many of whom are the ones who make it happen on a day-to-day basis. And that is going to, this is where I'm getting a little nervous, but you'll back me up. So that is going to the Reverend Mike Angel from the Episcopal Church, Caroline Fan from the Asian American community, who is the co-chair of our dialogue group, Guillermo Rodriguez, who co-chairs our Shalom Amigos Jewish Hispanic dialogue group, Reverend Gabrielle Kennedy, who has been involved in a number of things, including Faith and for the Sake of All, and I think through Eden, and Ram Lakshmanan from the Hindu community, who every one of them I can go on and on about. But we're incredibly excited. This is our chance to really give thanks to all of those people who do the work on a day-to-day basis to make it happen for JCRC and for our entire community. So I just wanted to lift up their names.
Wonderful. Thank you, Rory. And well done. Okay, so our next meeting, May 9th, it's our May 8th, correct your calendar. May 8th will be our annual meeting. So we'll vote on a slate of new at-large council members and JCRC officers. So I hope you all will be there and have a safe evening and a wonderful Passover.